Before introducing our first keynote speaker, please allow me to add a couple of personal words of gratitude on my behalf. When the National Library approached me last summer and asked if I would be interested in co-organizing an international conference on web archiving, I couldn't believe the rare opportunity that fell into my hands. The international guests in the audience may not realize this, but holding a conference with so many esteemed international speakers here in Israel is a rare event. Both the library and myself were first skeptical. We assumed that many of you would be hesitant or reluctant to accept our invitations. We are overwhelmed with gratitude that all of you were happy to accept our invitations, and that thanks to you, we are able to bring to Israel the best knowledge and expertise in the field of web archiving, web history, and digital cultural heritage. Thank you. I would also like to thank the local audience for attending the conference and acknowledging the importance of this event, even though some of you are not working directly in the field of web archiving. Thanks to your participation, I hope we will be able to raise awareness to the importance of web archiving in the local community. I would like to express my deepest gratitude to the National Library for initiating and hosting this event. Thanks are extended to my partners at the National Library, Mr. Owen Weinberg, CEO of the National Library, Dr. Aviad Stolman, Head of Collections, and Dr. Milka Rubin Levy, Curator of Humanities Collection. Thanks to Mr. Yaron Deutscher, Head of Digital, and his team for designing the beautiful conference website and the virtual exhibition that accompanies this conference. Thank you, my wonderful OmiLab team, you know who you are, for your wonderful support and dedicated work. Special thanks are extended to Tzipi Lazar-Shoef for her assistance in curating the virtual exhibition. Finally, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to two women who worked days and nights behind the scenes and under a lot of pressure, without whom none of this could have happened. Thank you, Mr. Aviva Zoller, for your meticulous work and hard efforts. And thank you, my dear colleague, Dr. Vered Zilber-Varod, for orchestrating every detail, big or small. Without further ado, I'm deeply honored to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Niels Brügger. Niels Brügger is Professor in Internet Studies and Digital Humanities and Head of the Center for Internet Studies as well as the Internet Research Infrastructure NetLab, Aarhus University, Denmark. His research interests are web historiography, web archiving, and media theory. Within these fields, he has published monographs and a number of edited books, as well as articles and book chapters. Recent publications include Web 25, a themed issue of new media in society, The Web as History, using web archives to understand the past and the present, and Web 25, Histories from the 25 years of the World Wide Web. He is co-founder and managing editor of the newly founded international journal Internet History, Digital Technology, Culture and Society. Professor Brügger, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Annette. This is my first time to Jerusalem. It's a fantastic city. I'm really stunned. And I come from Denmark, but before going here, I came from Brussels. I was evaluating EU proposals for ERC, European Research Council. Not that it has anything or had anything to do with this, what I'm going to talk about here, but it turned out that it had anyway, because there was a person in the panel. We are sitting in panels, some 15 persons, discussing the proposals. And there was a guy coming from Israel, and we just chatted a little bit. Said, oh, do you know about this web archiving thing? Yeah, sure I do. I've been working with that for 15 years. And he had seen it on television here in Israel. A young scholar. Annette? Probably, I guess. No? Okay, but he had seen someone on television here in Israel talking about introducing web archives. So I thought, okay, there's something going on down there. So I'll take that up, and then I will take you through my presentation. Oh, I think we have to change something here. I'm a poor Mac guy. Is there a Windows person here? is maybe here. So, this is a title. And I'll start with this page. It's the web page of whitehouse.gov as it looked in January last year when Obama, when he left office. You could drill down on the page and see there was a point called climate change. If you then went further or had a look the next day, when Trump wanted to make America great again, this is what it looked like. And you could see there was no climate change. So this was a big discussion going on about that. And it's not that unusual. So I went back and found the page of George Bush. When Obama took over, there was this point about the energy and environment. Obama took over in 2009, still January, and he actually kept that, but he added a number of other things and deleted a number of other things that were on the Bush website. So, what can we learn from this? We can learn that what I call the digital-born material grows. It grows fast. What I call the reborn digital material, which is the archive material, it grows fast as well. And we can learn also that the web is an inherent part of political life, social life, cultural life. We couldn't imagine a president or someone running for president without a website. And we can also learn, which is maybe one of the most important things, that the online web is not in itself an archive. It is volatile, it's deleted, it's changed, it's changing all the time. And that's particularly interesting when we compare it to other media types. I'm going to do that a lot in the coming minutes. And most importantly, we have to preserve, or someone have to preserve the web while it's online, so that we can keep it for posterity. So the only reason I could show these instances of the whitehouse.gov page was that the Internet Archive had archived it. So we have to preserve this to document our past. So this is the agenda I'm going to take you through, and I realize that some of you may not be that familiar with web archiving. Others of you are very familiar with it. So some of you may have to take a nap at some point, go on Facebook, whatever. But you can judge that yourself. So I'm going to talk about what I call digitality first. Digitality, by that I mean the way that a digital medium is digital. I'm not going to elaborate more on that, but just have that in mind. I'm going to talk about 3 forms of digitality: digitized, born digital, and reborn. Then I'm going to look at the online web, because what is actually going to be my argument is this line here. Because what happens when we archive the web is that we start with the online web. Then it is collected, preserved, made available, and then the scholars may use it. Every time we shift from one phase to another, we transform the material. So this is mainly going to be my main argument, that we transform what we are preserving every time we take a step. And continue, if you imagine when we start here and we end up here, we have actually made a lot of transformations, which may not be documented even. So they can be really hard to find out what has happened. So this is going to be the structure. So I start with the online web. Then I have a small parenthesis, you could say, about how you can analyze the web. What can be your focus points? I call that web strata, and I distinguish between the visible web and the hidden web. Then about archiving the web, this is this one. The digitality of the archived web, this is this. Making the archived web available, and then I'll end up with an agenda for the future. The last point, I'm not going to talk much about that, so it's just so that you know that this is in a way where the researchers come in. Okay, I'm talking about this based on a book that is almost published. It's been typeset now, and I was allowed to by the publisher to give you the introduction to the book. So if you want, you can go and download it here on this URL. You can read more about the book here. It doesn't have a cover yet, so this is how it looks on the website on the publisher. But still, so if you want to grab the introduction, use this strange URL. Okay, so the digitality of the online web. What is the online web? What characterizes the online web as a digital medium? That's what I'm going to talk about now. So I start with kind of a major thing about it's some kind of the overall framework in a way for what I'm talking about, what I call the forms of digitality. If you look at digital media, they're not digital in the same way, they are digital in different ways. So how can we cluster this? So I use a 3 clustering model, so to say. So we have the digitized material. That's material that has been analog at some point. It could be a newspaper, radio, television, and then it's digitized. So then we have, after that, the born digital, and that's the material that has never existed in any other form than digital. There's only digital. You can't go back and see the printed version of a website. And then we have what I call the reborn digital. And that's the born digital material that has been archived and that has been changed in this process of archiving. I'm going to talk a lot about that. But I'm also going to talk about the digitized because I'm going to compare digitized newspapers to the reborn digital material. So just so that you know that. So this is the overall the frame of what's going on. So the online web. If someone asked you what characterizes the online web in all its instances, no matter what's on it, what would be your answer? This is my answer at least. So I'm comparing it to, as I mentioned, to a digitized collection. You could imagine newspapers as a digitized collection. Digitized newspapers, they usually only have one layer of digital text. They come with one layer, and that's it. You can add another layer, for instance OCR, but they're not born with that. So digitized newspapers are, in a way, flat. In contrast to that, the online web is 2-layered. In a way, you have what you see on the screen in your browser, and then you have what is hidden under the hood, you could say. The HTML file, the files that are shown in the HTML. So the web is double. If you have this web page here, just a Yahoo from a day, and then beneath that you have the HTML code. So this in a way illustrates the doubleness of the web. What you see and what you don't see. But what you don't see is the condition for what you see. But it is both. Next thing, the digitized collections, they only have basically one copy equals one file. If you have a newspaper page that has been digitized, you have one file for each page, probably. You could have more, but usually you only have one page. This is very, very different from the web. Because what you see on a web, when you open a web page, it's a collection of fragments. It's fragments, it's bits and pieces that are pieced together based on what is written in the HTML file, the files that are dragged in and presented for you. So you have this fragmented nature to the online web, which is very different from what is digitized. The last point is the hyperlink. If you digitize newspapers, you could add hyperlinks if you wanted to. You're not obliged to, but it can be nice and neat, but you're not obliged to. But that is totally different with the web. The web is born with hyperlinks. Try to remove the hyperlinks. You wouldn't be able to move around on the web. You had to insert the exact URL, the exact web address, every time you wanted to open a new page. So the hyperlink is something that is closely related to the nature of the web. So these would be my 3 answers to if someone asked me what is the web, what is the digitality of the web. 2-layered, fragments, and HTML. Very much different from digitized collections. So if you want to study the web, what could you then study? This is more on the scholarly use of it side, but not about web archives, but I have to mention that as well. And I would say you could focus on 5 different web strata, as I call them, 5 different analytical objects. You could start with the smallest one, which would be a web element, could be an image on a web page, heading, text, whatever. Then you can focus on the next strata, which is the page, and the strata they are mentioned here. The web page, illustrated like this, you could focus on that. There have been studies of web pages. For instance, if you want to focus on layout or stuff like that, you probably have the page as your focal point. You could focus on the website, which is interrelated web pages. You could focus on what I call the web sphere, which is actually a term I borrow from Kirsten Foot and Steve Schneider. The web sphere is something that is taking place on the web. It's not a website, but it's bigger, It's about what happens in relation to an event. Could be political election, it could be any topic that you want to study. Say you want to study political elections, presidential elections, you want to study the web sphere related to that. That's all the websites, web pages related to that. Or you could study the web as a whole. I made this as a cloud. Could be browsers, for instance. They're not related to pages or elements or websites or spheres, but they are in a way transcending all this. So what this could be the analytical objects you could study. But you could also, this is on a visible side, as I mentioned before, but you could also study each of those on the hidden level. So it would look a little bit like this. You can't see it very good, but it's written code here. So if you study the web element on the hidden, on a code level, that could be one single line in an HTML document. Say you wanted to study hyperlinks. So you can just take out each of the lines in the HTML that is the hyperlink. So that would be a web element on the hidden level. Web page could be, well, the HTML file in a way is the page. The website could be a CMS system, content management system, that in a way delimits the website on a technical level, which you don't see. The web sphere is a little bit harder to figure out how you can do that. It could be something with a link analysis, following links. And the web as a whole could be something about all the code that in a way also transcends all the elements. It could be the HTML as such. It could be internet code, etc. So this would be my ways of, if you ask me, I want to study the web, what can I focus on? These would be my answers. The strata, they are interwoven with each other. Each stratum is, in a way, the context for each of the other ones. The thing that you may want to have a closer look at is how is the content of each of the strata generated. So this is focusing on what I presented here, is focusing on the analytical objects and not how stuff got onto the web page. So if you want to study the web page, this approach is not concerned about how did the material, how did the content get on the page, but just focusing on the page. And it's also not about this approach about how much material is studied. You could study the web element, which is a small element, but you study billions of those. So it doesn't mean that if you study small elements, you just also have to make small data. Two other things in relation to these layers. We have, I should have this first. If you focus on, and this is a very important thing, talking about big data, and also important in web archives, if you focus only on the visible side, the web page, what you see, if you want to study that, that doesn't scale well. You cannot read 2 million web pages by browsing them. It's not possible. So that's a very important thing to have in mind. If you want to study what's happening on the web page, it doesn't scale. So you have to use what is hidden if you want to scale. And then we have a number of issues related to the relation between the two layers, namely a question of translating. Because if you want to study the visible layer, you have to approach it. I mean, if you just want to study that, you approach it as you would do with any kind of visible thing you study. So that's kind of the easy one. But if you want to involve then the hidden side, if you want to study the visible side and you want to involve also what is in the code, then you have to find out how can this, what I'm going to study on a visible side, be translated to the code. And the last one, if you want to study the hidden one and find out how that translates to the visible side, that's also in itself a challenge. So if you want to study the code, you have to know how does this translate to the visible, to what you see. If you study, I don't know, any piece of code, you have to know how does that translate to what you actually see. So this is these interrelations between the hidden and the visible layers. So The online web has a number of possibilities and a number of challenges when you're going to archive it. So let's have a closer look at what is web archiving. So now I'm going to the next point, collecting web archiving. I use this broad definition of web archiving, any form of deliberate and purposive collecting and preserving of web material. It's a very broad definition. What is mostly used in terms of web archiving is web crawling, but I have a broader definition. So in my definition, web archiving can be the following. It can be web crawling based on following hyperlinks. Can also be screenshots. You've probably done that, all of you. Taking screenshots works quite well. You can get it. And again, that doesn't scale that well, but you can do it. It can be a nice way of keeping the web. You can make a screen movie. That's a small movie about what's happening on a website. It's very good if you want to have interaction that cannot be preserved with the crawling. You can also retrieve the web with an API. If the website you're going to archive has an API access, you can do that. There are challenges with each of these, I can tell you. And then you can also use the old offline web. You can get that from the owner of the website. Lots of examples of that as well. And then you can actually also use non-digital media. If we are going to study the old web, very old web, 94, 95, we probably have to study it as it was depicted in how-to books about how do I use the web, etc., etc. So this would probably be the main sources from the old web. So I'm going to focus on this one, web crawling. This is what I'm going to talk about now. The other ones are also interesting. I have a lot of chapters about them in my book, but now I'm going to focus in on web archiving because this is probably what you're going to do here at the library. So I'm comparing, again, the digitized on the left to the archiving of the online web on the right. So the digitized is based on, as I mentioned before, a non-digital original. We have something. We may have a paper, a newspaper in print that we can go back to. With the online web, when it's archived, there is no original to go back to. You can't find the old web. If it's gone, it's gone. I couldn't go back and find the old Bush website, for instance, from 2009. It would be gone. So that's a huge, huge difference. With the digitized collection or digitization, what and how you do the digitization is not complex. It's quite transparent and it's systematic. This does not mean that it is trivial to digitize. I know that. But once you have solved the problems, you have solved them for all the cases, so to say. And it's transparent because you know if you make an error, if there is an error, that error will occur every time that the same instance happens. So this is digitization. If you look at web archiving then, and this is just the interface to a web archiving tool called httrack. It's a very amateur-like thing. Libraries don't use that. But this is just to show you what you have to do when you want to archive the web, because you have to set a number of settings. So how many links should the archiving software follow, where you start from one web address? Should it then follow links unendlessly, or only 2 levels away, 3 levels, or what have we? Should it include images or not? Should it include video, etc.? This is just to illustrate that you have to make a number of decisions as to what and how is going to happen when you archive the web with web crawling. In a way, it is not transparent and it is very unsystematic. Basically, you put in the web addresses you want to archive, you press go, and off the crawlers they go. And what happens out there? Well, basically you don't know exactly what happens. You get something back, you may get a lot back that you didn't want to get back, and you may not get some of the stuff that you wanted to have. So it is unsystematic, and you don't know what's happening, basically. Digitized, what is digitized is what you see or hear. A newspaper, you digitize a newspaper, and that's it. It's flat in a way. So what you archive with the archived web is HTML files and all the other files that the HTML is pulling in. And HTML is not what you see. You have to have a browser to see the HTML or something similar. So digitization, you digitize what you see, the paper, which is not the case. You actually digitize, or you actually archive the HTML with web archiving. So this is also very important to have in mind. Web pages are not archived as you see them in a browser. This is not what happens with web crawling. What is archived is this, the HTML files. So you don't archive what you see. Again, remember the two layers of the web, the visible layer and the HTML layer, or the code layer, you could say. You only archive the latter. Digitization, very robust, can be remade. If you make an error, you can go back and say, oh, I didn't get this page, or I didn't get the images, I can scan it again, etc., etc. You can remake it. This is not the case with the online web. Things go wrong, and believe me, they do, and you can go back. You may be able to go back and say, okay, this went wrong, I can grab it, but it may be changed or it may be gone. So it's a different story. You have a stable original, which you don't have with the online web. We have instead what I call the dynamics of updating. Dynamics of updating, by that I mean that imagine you're going to archive a website. You put in the web address, you start from the top, the National Library of Israel's web address, you start with that, and you press go, and the crawler then goes down into the structure of the website. It may take an hour. Once you reach the bottom, the front page may have changed. So what you get in your archive, if you try to trap that, then the bottom may have changed. And you can continue like that unendlessly. So what you get in an archive, in a web archive, to some extent at least, is something that has never existed in that specific form when it was online. So you get an abstract thing that was not there actually when you archived. It may have been there when you started your archiving, but it may have changed when you end your archiving. So it's a totally different type of document. It's not like a stable newspaper that you can digitize. With the newspaper, we are used to temporal spatial subdivisions that are made by the publisher. We have dates. Newspapers are usually published on a date. We have pages. They are bound together to make a copy. Websites don't come with this. You have spatial and temporal subdivisions in terms of days, hours, or pages. They're not part of the website as such. To a certain degree, they have to be made by the archiving institution. So it is the archiving institution who decides how big the website is in a way. It would be as if you were digitizing newspapers and you said, okay, I just want page 2, 5, and 10. Don't care about the others. That's how it is to archive the web compared to digitization. Digitization, you only get one copy of each. There is no good reason why you should digitize the same newspaper page 10 times. So you only get one of each. With the archived web, you get a lot of that material more than once, which makes it extremely messy. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Imagine again, you start with the top, you want to archive a website, go down the structure, and remember it follows links. So you may have a link pointing to a page above, so you may archive that page again. Okay, of course, you can make some settings where this doesn't happen, but imagine then you have your website pointing to another website, so you archive that. That points back to where you started, so you actually get that twice. And that may happen all the time. It may happen thousands of times. So you may get the same instance of the web several times, which is again different from the newspapers where you only get one of each page. It would be as if you would say, oh, I think page 10 is very nice. I think I'll have 2 of those. That would never happen. There was no good reason to make that happen. So, preserving the digitality of the archived web. What characterizes the things that we have then got in the archive? What characterizes the preserved web? First of all, it is characterized by a number of uncertainties compared to what was online when it was online. There's so many uncertainties that I don't even have the time to mention all of them, but there are a lot, and I'm going to go through a couple of them. So we have to remember, as I mentioned before, what is in the web archive is only the HTML files. Only the invisible layer is archived. It means also that it is fragments that is archived. You should imagine a web archive as a huge bucket of files. HTML files, image files, video files, whatever files you have. And these files are patched together by the hyperlinks, to a large degree at least. So this is what is preserved. It's HTML files and files. So as I mentioned, a big bucket of interconnected files. That is, in a way, what a web archive is. So imagine you have the online web, you collect it, and this is basically what you get. Again, we can compare with the digitized collection and the archived web in terms of preserving. Digitized papers, newspapers, digitized collections are preserved in an orderly manner, so to say. You know what you have in your collection, you can search it, you can find stuff, and it's quite easy to maneuver, to navigate. A web archive is unsystematic, it's messy, it's heterogeneous. It is really a mess. You don't imagine how messy it is. Trying to do some research with that, it's a challenge. But of course, it's not messy like that. There are some structures still, but it is more messy compared, at least, to a digitized collection. In the digitized collection, you only have one of each, as I mentioned. In a web archive, you may have either too little or too much. You have too little if what you wanted to get in the archive was not archived. And that can be an element of the page that, for whatever reason, images didn't go on, were not captured. Or it can be anything, can be an entire website that is not there. So a lot of stuff is missing. But then on the other hand, you may have too much. Because remember what I mentioned before, you may get the same element, same page, several times on almost the same point in time. So what you may have is hundreds, thousands of the same web element. So in that sense, you have way too much. And it makes it extremely difficult to navigate this. Because how do you make a corpus out of that? I mean, it would be as if you had newspapers. And in some cases, you had, newspapers from 1 year. Some of the days you only had pages 2 and 3. Some of the days you had pages 5 and 10. And others you had 10 times of page 5, etc., etc. That's how it is to navigate a web archive. Spatial consistency, clear borders is what characterizes a digitized collection. It is, you have a spatial delimitation of the newspaper. You know where it starts and ends. And the borders are quite clear. This is not the case with the web, as you could probably imagine. It is spatial inconsistent in the sense that if you go to a web archive, you may have some of the websites archived only the front page, some of them 5 levels, some of them 10 levels, and anything in between those. So it would be as if the newspapers, again, you decided, I don't want more than 5 pages, and then 2 days later I want 10 or whatever. Temporal consistency is also what characterizes the newspapers, digitized collection. They are there. There's one from each point in time, so to say. Again, archived web, it is temporal inconsistent because we have this dynamics of updating that I mentioned before, because archiving takes time. Imagine you're going to do a study of links, and things have changed during the time it takes to archive it. Just during 1 hour, it may change a lot. Imagine if that scales up to 2 months. The link structure has, changed quite substantially, probably. Digitized collections, you have a copy. You have a copy, and you have the original, and you make a copy of that. Quite easy. What you get in a web archive is what I term a unique version. It's a version because you may have other versions. And it's unique Each of them are unique because they are the only one from that point in time. So it's not copies, it's unique versions. You can't even say that one of the versions is the most original version. They're only versions. So, and none of them is the original, because the original was online, and we don't have that, probably. So it is a mess of unique versions, of which none is the original, and none can be maintained, or could be said to be, the original. So now continuing to the making it available. And as you can see, we have been through a number of transformations from the online to the collecting. A lot of stuff was happening there. What you get in is something different than what was online, and collecting, from the collecting to the preserving, things happen there as well. So now going on to making it available. A digital collection, newspapers, there is no temporality involved in displaying the newspaper when it's digitized. By that I mean, when you see a newspaper page digitized, you see what there is, and it is there, all of it, in the same point, at the same point in time, so to say. So you can imagine this is not the case with the web, at least if it is replayed with what is called the Wayback Machine or similar. Because what happens there is that there may be some sort of temporality embedded in the displaying of the web page. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. So this is a web page shown with a Wayback Machine, the British Library from the state, 2009, their web page. So then you can use some software called the Momento time travel. This, I have to thank my colleague Jane Winters for this slide. The Momento time travel, what it does is it goes down and checks all the elements that are used, all the fragments that are used to compose this web page, when were they archived? So we wanted to have this web page from 23rd of July 2009. So it goes down and fetches all the bits and pieces that are used to knit together this web page as close as possible to the date we wanted. But apparently it doesn't have all the elements. So this is, here you can see a timeline where it mentions how many hours, days, that each of the elements of the page differ from the date that we wanted to. Can you follow this? So we wanted to see the web page from one date. The archive doesn't have all the bits and pieces to make that web page, so it pulls in bits and pieces from weeks before, days later, whatever. So what you have here is a thing that we have probably never seen before. At least we are not used to it. Because it has this, as I mentioned here, an embedded temporality when it's replayed. So again, this is very different from a digitized newspaper. Images, text, it's there because it was there in the first place at the same time. The web page is composed based on bits and pieces coming from different points in time. You could, of course, say, I do not want all this temporal inconsistency. I just want it from that date, the date we are asking for. Then you may lose a number of the elements, which could also be fine. At least we would like to know. So, digitized newspaper, it's a relatively stable collection. When you have digitized it, it doesn't change. You can change it, but there are not many good reasons for changing what you have already digitized. With the web changes all the time, so just in order to be able to catch it and to preserve it, you may have to also develop your collection. So it's a much more dynamic thing, a web archive, because you have to keep up with what's happening on the online web. And the web archive itself may also develop. And again, it's extremely important once you start making a web collection that you document this. Good link to my next point, easy to document information about provenance with a digitized collection. You can document provenance when was this newspaper digitized, what were the settings, etc., etc. And once you've done that, you've more or less done it for the entire collection. It is much more difficult to document the online web, the archived web. You can do that. You have something in what is called the crawl log, which tells you where did the archiving software go. You may have something from your curators, etc., but you have to find some way of presenting that to a researcher. So the information may be there, but as researchers, we would like to have it. And we would like to have it in a form that we can use and at the right point and in the process that we are working with. And this is something that is up for debate, how you can do that. A digitized collection, there is a limited number of ways of making this collection available. Again, imagine a newspaper collection. You can search it, and that's more or less it, basically. And almost all researchers using this digitized newspaper collection have to access it in the same way. So it's a one size fits nobody, or fits a lot, but still it's the same that people have to find, the same approach to the collection. With the archived web, there is a large number of ways of approaching that. So just to illustrate that, if you have what I mentioned before, the online web, it's archived. So you have this huge bucket of files. So there's so many ways that you can take them out. Actually, there are almost as many ways you can take them out as we have people in this room. Just to give you a few examples. You may want to study the web as it looked in a web browser. Fine. You have to have it presented in the Wayback Machine. So this is what you would like to have. If you're focused on layout, whatever, the elements on the web page, you would like it to have it out like that. But you may not be interested in what it looked like at all. No, you're interested in hyperlinks. You just want to know how were things connected. So you say, I don't care about the Wayback Machine. Just give me all the links. I can make a link graph and I'm fine. Another way of doing it. Maybe you're interested in named entities of whatever kind. So you can say, just give me the named entities. I don't care about links. I don't care about anything else. Named entities, that's just my game. Any kind of words you could take out. If you want to search for presidential election or whatever, you can search for these words and do whatever type of analysis you would like to do with that. I have a project in Denmark right now, together with the Danish Web Archive, and we have created corpora of one corpus from each year on the Danish web from 2005 to 15. And we have these corpora now, that's about 25 terabyte each of them each year. They have a supercomputer at the National Library in Denmark, and we're going to use that. And what we're going to do is we have just last week extracted all the text on the entire Danish web domain .dk. If you imagine you have all that text, it's 1 million domain names. We have all that text, and we'd like to search it. And we'd like to know where does the terms, on which websites do they sit. So we search for, I don't know, parliament election. And then we get a list, and then we combine that with the web domains where each of the words are listed. And that in itself can be really, really interesting to see. So that was just a sidetrack in a way. You can also be interested in images. Don't care about links, names, words. That's not my game. I want to study images. So you can take out all the images. You can do that on a web domain level. You can do that on a number of levels. We're also going to do that in the study of the entire Danish web. We're trying to extract images as well. So this is just to illustrate that a web archive is something that you can study in so many ways, because if you remember where I started with the online web, it is fragments. So you can actually take out each of these fragments and make them your analytical object, which is very different from from Digitized Collections. Yes, this is more or less what I mentioned here. So this means also that we have many ways of approaching these collections. And this is also a challenge because, as I mentioned here comes the question about resources. Because if you imagine you're a web archive collection, you have this room full of researchers. Oh, I want this, I want that, couldn't you do this, etc., etc. I want it in this way and that way. So we have to have some sort of forum to negotiate between the research communities and the web archive collections. How should we make these collections available? Should we have, say, a standard, which would be, 5 ways of accessing the material, and then people have to come with some funding if they want it accessed in different ways of doing that. But at least it's up for discussion, it's up for debate, how you should access that, and what should the national libraries or the collections, what should they provide in terms of access. Then on a more detailed level, what we need, as you probably can hear from my presentation here, we need some sort of what I call a philology of the archived web. Philology, old tradition, studying texts, this is philology in a different setting. There may be some of the tricks that we can still use. They may be useful. As you remember, I talked about versions, comparing versions, not to find an original, but to find the least bad of the versions, you could say. There you could use philology. So philology, I think there's something to use there, but in a new setting. We had to have a philology that in a way works on the grounds of the digitality of the archived web. Yeah, here we may be in a better position than the classical philology was or is, because we actually have the hidden level, the code level, and that can tell us a lot. Parchment doesn't come with several levels. It may in some sense, but if it's a palimpsest, but still, it doesn't normally. But the web comes with these levels, or the hidden level, so you can actually use that. Say if there is an image, you can't see what the image should have been, it wasn't archived, but there may be a piece of code telling the name of the image file, and you can use that. So we may be in a better position with this type of web philology. We need some tools, what I call a web philological toolbox. That's what we need to make this grow. I mentioned documentation earlier. We need as much documentation as possible to make informed choices. We have to make choices because we know it's not perfect by no means. But we have to make as informed choices as possible so that we, in a way, know what we do, and so we know why it is as bad as it sometimes is. So, an agenda for the future, the last point. Something is happening with our object, the web. The web is not the only digital medium now. It may not be the most prevalent in many ways. Apps, mobile media, have grown in number and numbers, and of course the collectors or the national libraries should find out how do you address this issue of apps. What can we do to preserve that? Should they? So there's something happening that could be something that is relevant for an agenda of the future. Something is happening with the object. But there are also some research interest things, some issues related to the research process that I would put on the agenda for the future within web archiving and the researcher use of web archives. So I mentioned a couple of times, documentation about provenance. Where does this come from? Why did this piece of digital object, why did it go in the archive? We need some research infrastructures as well. I mentioned we have this supercomputer sitting at the Royal Library in Denmark that we can use to make large-scale studies of the Danish web archive, but we need more like that. And we need some transnational collaboration as well. a topic that is very important that has not been debated much. I know there was a meeting in the US, I guess it was a month ago, 3 weeks ago, about this, research ethics related to doing web history, something that we have to address. And then the last thing is to propagate the idea of what I call web archive literacy. What I've been talking about here is what you could say is it's a theory about web archive literacy. So how can we teach people to read the archive web? Yes, I guess this was the last slide. Thank you. Any questions? Are there time for questions? Okay, good, good.
Thank you very much for your talk, and we can take questions now from the audience.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, you talked about apps, but to me, one of the things that I see is that sites like Facebook seem to be closed a lot of the times. I mean, it depends what it is, but there's a lot of discussion, a lot of content on sites like that that is closed off from crawlers and things like that. And how do you... Now, my question is just how to deal with sites like Facebook that are closed off from the crawlers, where a lot of the content and a lot of content is moving to sites like that. Discussions that happened on open websites have moved to Facebook groups and Facebook pages and all these kind of things, and those are actually very hard to access.
Yeah. First of all, I'm not a web archivist. Happy about that. I'm a researcher. I studied in the web and its history. So I would like to have as much of Facebook preserved as possible. I know there's some issues there. But as far as I know, the open web pages or the open groups on Facebook can be archived. And I know in the Danish Web Archive, they actually archive them. There may be a challenge in tracking down to find the material you want to archive. If you, for instance, if you're a national web archive, you're kind of delimited by the national borders. So in my case, Denmark, where to find Denmark on Facebook? That can be a challenge. You could use the .dk, the top-level domain, the country code top-level domain on the web, but it's not that easy on Facebook. You can filter by different other ways, but it's a little bit more fluffy, I would say. But and then of course you have all the rest on Facebook, which is closed behind passwords. And national web archives have usually not preserved that at all anyway. It would be as if it was a private website that no one could access except for a specific group of people. That would never have gone in a national web archive anyway.
Thank you very much for this fascinating presentation, and especially the last point you were bringing up, the question of ethics in archiving internet websites and so on. And I think this is a totally new agenda that we as archivists, I'm an archivist, have to get used to in order to not producing faked archives for future use, because as you said, it's fragmented. You can piece it together anytime in a different way, wherever needed or how needed. So the question is, who needs what and who has a certain interest of needing something in this way or in that way. And I think that also brings up the question how we can ensure to make our web archives safe, meaning that they really preserve what was intended to brought up.
Many questions there, I guess. The first thing you mentioned about if the collections preserve what should be preserved, is that correctly understood? As a researcher, I would like if they preserve as much as possible of what was online. Don't care about if it's fake or whatever. If it's fake, they should of course preserve that as well. But the preservation should not be fake, of course. And in a way, you could say that all types of web archiving, or web crawling at least, is in some way not fake, but not exactly knowing what's happening, as I mentioned. At least to some degree they do, but also at a certain level, it is imprecise. Again, when you compare it to, for instance, digitized newspapers or similar. But that's just how it is. I mean, if you want to archive at that scale, as we would like to, I would like all of the Danish web, okay, then you have to accept all these flaws and all these errors, or whatever we should call it, because it's not errors, but it's shit happens, like. Yeah. I don't know if that was an answer. Okay. Yeah.
About the versions problem or characteristics of the internet, in linguistics we're talking about phonemes and the realizations of the phonemes. Each time I pronounce Niels, I pronounce it differently, but the abstract is there. So is it possible to archive a prototype or an abstract entity of a page or all the elements, and the realizations and the versions are, of course, innermost?
That's a really interesting thing. I hadn't thought of that way. I have a background myself from French language and linguistics as well, so I've also read Trubetskoy, and I know what the difference between phoneme and stuff. And it's a good point. I don't know where we should find that abstract thing, that abstract version of it. I don't know which one it should be in a way. If you have, say, 10 versions of the same web page, but again, it could be something that we could do in terms of Webphilology, and I've written a text about that some years ago, and I tried to set up some guide, some rules that can guide this Webphilology, and you may be able to do that. And especially if when you have the code, you may actually be in a good position. You can say all of these bits and pieces were the same, but these 10 were not. Yeah, interesting.
I would like to ask you if you are aware of any attempt engaging intelligence agencies. Intelligence agencies archive the web and the mobile communications and email communications in very large share of those communications. Are you aware of any attempt of preserving this material for historical purposes after tens of years?
Intelligence.
What?
Intelligence service. Oh, sorry. Intelligence services.
Intelligence services.
Yeah. No, I don't know.
The National Security Agency, the CIA.
They probably have it all.
What?
They probably have it all.
No, but because it's an effort, undergoing effort, but it's kept and is archived. So if there was any kind of attempt of preserving this material, because there are archiving laws in every country that preserves governmental materials for research purposes.
Yeah.
And with a delay of opening it for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 70 years. In principle, those agencies' materials fall under the same scope.
I don't know if there's anything happening in that direction. I think the National Web Archives usually only preserve what was made publicly available. So if it wasn't publicly available, and that's probably the case that it wasn't, then it will not go into these archives. So it should be. It's something I didn't mention actually, because then we have taken even more time. But the word archive in web archiving is in many ways not a good term. Because archiving, we usually tend to say archiving, we have usually this split with cultural heritage institutions. At least we have two splits. We have one split saying everything that is in writing goes this way, and then all the objects, the artifacts goes the other way to the museums. So then we have the documents, and we have usually two types of organizations. We have the libraries, they preserve what has been made publicly available, and then we have the archives, preserve that has not been made publicly available. The thing is that web archives preserve what has been made publicly available. So the term web archive is not very good. I have suggested the term webrary. That does not work. but nice try. But no. So I guess we're stuck with Web Archive. And I guess what you're talking about is more something that the archives, traditional sense archives, should preserve. So, yeah.
Hi. I have a question regarding the term web sphere. It seems to me that all the other elements, like the one element, like the photograph of the entire web or web page, are concrete elements. And if I understood correctly, the term web sphere, it's more of a sociological term. It's because there's still images, there's two images, but each of them can relate to other web spheres. Am I correct? So is it actually the job of the web archiver to archive the web spheres, or is it more of the job for me as a film scholar to archive the film sphere, or is it an interdisciplinary realm or site? Where does it fall?
It became maybe a little bit unclear, but when I talk about these 5 web strata, it's something that happens on the researcher end of things. So when you're looking on the web, you say to yourself, okay, how can I focus my study? So this is my way of giving 5 different ways, 5 levels of focusing your study. So it's something that the researcher makes, not the archiving institutions. But they can use it as well, because if you, as they do in the Danish context, they archive events. So Danish National Web Archive, they archive up to 4 national events every year, and that is in a way a web sphere that they archive. So you can use the term either as a kind of a guideline for your archiving, and you can use it as a researcher. And again, it is, as you mentioned, a more sociological thing, because it is the researcher who constructs the web sphere. So I may decide that this website should be part of the web sphere about the presidential elections. Another researcher may say it shouldn't. Depends on what is your scope and your research question.
And do you think that there's possibility for in the future, let's say, if I as a film scholar want to search one certain very particular web sphere for artificial intelligence, which I know very little of, to contact a web archiver and ask him, can you create a crawler or whatever that can find me the specific web spheres for, I don't know.
Yeah, it's maybe a sophisticated way of searching. So if you have a word, a term that is related to the film you're looking for, you may just do a search for that and then come up with a list of web domains where the term can be found. And then that may be your web sphere.
Thank you.
Great talk. It seems to me that you're doing very, truly fundamental work in the sense of translating this discourse or this academic discipline of archiving and bringing it to the web world. So my question to you is almost a bit philosophical. When do we reach the point, either in chronological web history or the point as researchers, I'm involved in researching Wikipedia, that we will depart from, these kind of almost print-based ideas? And that touches a bit about what you said about web archiving as almost being anachronistic. But when do we depart that and reach a point where we need our own mythologies and we're not, kind of almost winking back to this old print-based world to get this legitimacy of, okay, we're also an archive, and this is not just, sociology gone wild on the internet or something like that?
Well, to some extent, we're already there. At least emerging. Okay. But of course, there's still some of the countries that do not yet have a national web archive. I know they struggle with their national libraries to get funding for this new thing, because it doesn't look like what they're usually doing. But again, that depends on where in the history of the web archive each nation is. For instance, in Denmark, the first attempt to archive the web was like a mirror of the printing press or the printing world. So what was archived in 1992, when the law was passed in Denmark, was only static web pages. That was web pages that were basically PDF documents that looked like books, that looked like journals. So a colleague of mine, we raised a lot of debate about that and said you have to preserve the website. That's how the web works. And the library, they actually wanted to, or at least a couple of people in the library wanted it to, but they couldn't get the funding. They couldn't convince their management that they should do so. But then they were just, in a way, sitting, waiting for the researchers to come and formulate the need, which we then did. And when the rest is history, in a way. So it was, the Danish Web Archive was created in 2005.
You explained about the preservation stage and copying the hidden layer. Now, after I have the HTML code, it's straightforward going to the actual font or whatever. Like, how do I know like I got the right visual out of the code? This is one question, and the other question is about research of activity in the web. Like you talked about the like a statical snapshot of what's out there. Not very statical, but if we had like 100,000 people going to a manifestation, we would know maybe from newspaper. Now, how many people got into websites? What did they do, etc.? This is another kind of archive, or that's it?
Yeah. So the first one, you had the hidden level, and then you want to find out if you got the right representation once you show it. I guess the short answer is you don't. You don't know if you have the right one, because it was shown at the time in a specific browser, maybe with some plugins, etc., etc. And you, in a way, if you should do it, I don't know, correctly in some sense, you should, in a way, re-establish the running environment at the time. So you should have an old browser from 1999 with the right plugins. In a way, you should also have the network, and you would realize that there was a reason why the web was called the World Wide Web at the time, etc., etc. So you, in a way, you should have it all to make it look exactly as it did. And that's probably never going to happen. So we have to make do with the best possible we can get, which is, yeah, probably what most web archives do today. So it's a good point to have in mind when you study the archive web, that what you actually see is a reconstruction based on what is in the archive, based on the hidden stuff in the big bucket of files. It is a reconstruction. And again, documentation, we want to know what happens behind the scenes, what happens under the hood of this presentation. Your other point was about the activity. No one preserved that, to my knowledge. You mean, if I understand it right, for instance, how many people used a certain website, what did they click on, etc., etc. That information is lost probably. It may sit on the web server of the ones who own the website in the first place, but they tend to throw it out. They just discard it and. Yeah, that could be. Yeah, so it's we probably have to look somewhere else for this type, and there may be some. At least in Denmark, we have a national organization who tracks what people do on the web, and it's used for media companies so that they can find out who uses the website, etc., etc. That information, I would really like to have that and have that preserved. Just to give you an impression, in Denmark, it was a company, Gallup, you probably know that as well, who had that thing going on for some years. Then they closed it down. And now all the information of all what has happened on the Danish web from 2003 to 6 is sitting on a server that Gallup has in Poland. And no one has access to it. And the software that can pull out the information is not maintained anymore. So we had tried to make an agreement with them to make them maintain this, but we know in a way that this is never going to happen.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. And I'd like to ask you whether if a researcher made a certain search or created a certain web form, what happens when another researcher wants to use the same format? can he actually recreate or reconstruct exactly the same search? Is there a certain way to cite your research so that it can be reused?
It's also being debated how we can do that. In the Internet Archive, I guess you have dates on the URL, right? Yes. There's a date on the URL, and that helps a lot. So that if you go into a web page, you go open a web page in the Internet Archive, 2 years later, I open the same web page from the same date. It should, in principle, be the same thing we see. And I guess it is. But we may want to have some more detailed information when we quote, when we make references. So I know some of my colleagues at the Royal Library in Denmark, they presented a paper last year in London about what is it called? PID? Persistent identifier thing for web archives. So that's in a way what we need. We need some persistent identifier for what is in the archived web. Yeah, still debating.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. So I liked your comparison between the digitized collection and the archived web. However, I do not completely agree with it because I think it is a matter of time span until the problems that occurred on the digital collections or the problems that occur in the archived web also occur with the digital collections. So I think that most of the problems that you said that are occurring with archived web, they're just occurring in a shorter notice than they used to occur with the digitized or printed collections. And just to give an example, for instance, the matter of provenance. Like these days, it might be difficult to determine the provenance of a website or archived web page, but if you're digitizing something that was printed 100 years ago, there's also this problem of provenance. So I just like to make, in my opinion, the problems are the same as there ever was with archiving. The new problem with web archiving is just that they're happening faster than you used to. I like to hear your comment on this.
I understand your point. The provenance of, say, something you found in, I don't know, 1800 something, is provenance on another level in a way, because you can discuss about that provenance, but you still have something to discuss about. You actually have something in front of you, piece of newspaper or letter, whatever, and you can then discuss, try to find out the provenance about that. But what happens with the archived web is that you don't have any original in front of you. You only have bits and pieces that you may have a timestamp, you may not. You may have all the files, you may not have all the files. So it's provenance on a whole other level, you could say, which is the lack of stability of what you have in front of you. So even discussing provenance is, to a much higher degree, a discussion between or evaluating different versions than evaluating an original that you have. And again, of course, you may have a point about what we digitize now. We have to migrate that probably every 10th year to another format. But again, it's what's happening then is something that is systematic. So once you migrate, you know exactly, I start with this, I do this, and this happens. This is not necessarily the case with the web. Once you have what's taking place in the archiving process. So it is, I would say, still different. But there may be a good point about migration still. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Please. This will be the last question.
As an owner and author of the internet site, news site for science in Hebrew, for more than 20 years, I'm worried what will be with my writing after some 120. how do I assure that in 50 years from now people can read what I wrote, even if it not in a printed way?
Well, I hope some of the nice people here at the National Library will will do what they can to preserve it. So yeah, someone have to preserve it, or you may want to consult the Internet Archive in the US. They may have a copy as well.
I found only the homepage, not the articles.
Probably if it's online, if it's on your web domain, it should be archived. Yeah, but I can't give you any guarantees.
Thank you.
Thank you for a very fascinating lecture. You didn't mention anything about security when we're dealing with the data that it's so volatile to manipulation and more than print or manuscript or documents in printing.
So you mean security in terms of that you can manipulate
Of
what
course.
is in the web archive?
And that applicable to both the digitized and the web archive.
I don't know actually what to answer because I'm not a web archivist, so I'm a researcher. I just come from the outside in a way. But maybe, yeah. So maybe you can ask it to Mark later today. He'll be asking. He comes from a web archive, a real web archive.
Niels, thank you very much for your wonderful talk.
Thank you.